It was a crisp, clear morning in Arlington, Virginia, the kind that made you feel the weight of history just by breathing the air. Rows of white marble headstones stretched across the green hills like a silent army standing in eternal formation. The nation's capital was alive with motion, yet reverent with remembrance. On this day, President Donald Trump was scheduled to speak at a solemn ceremony to honor America's fallen heroes. The crowd had gathered early mothers with photographs clutched to their chests, veterans in full dress uniforms, and young children trying to comprehend the magnitude of sacrifice that surrounded them. As the Marine Band played softly in the background and dignitaries took their seats, President Trump stepped out from his motorcade, walking toward the stage with his usual composure. But just as he neared the podium, something caught his eye. Amid the rows of attendees stood a lone Marine, still and statuesque in his dress blues. He was young, perhaps in his early 20s, but what drew the president's attention wasn't just his perfect posture or polished appearance. It was his eyes. They were red, heavy with sorrow, and a single tear traced down his cheek as he stared silently toward the sea of graves behind the stage. President Trump paused. Just for a moment, then, with a quiet word to his security detail, "I want to speak." To that Marine, he altered course and stepped off the prepared path. The Secret Service flinched slightly, caught off guard, but followed closely as Trump made his way into the crowd. Murmurs rose, phones came out. Reporters and camera crews scrambled to adjust their focus. No one knew what was happening. The Marine, sensing the president's approach, snapped to attention. His hand flew to his brow in a sharp salute. Trump stopped before him, returned the salute with care, then gently lowered the Marine's hand. "At ease, son," he said. "What's your name?" "Lance Corporal Jace Turner, sir," came the steady reply. "And why are you crying, Turner?" Trump asked, his voice low and sincere. The crowd fell utterly silent. Jace hesitated, his lips quivered, and he drew in a shaky breath before speaking. "Sir, it's not about me. It's about who we left behind." The president's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing slightly with interest and concern. "Tell me," he said. Jace looked down, his voice strained with emotion. "I made a promise to someone, and I couldn't keep it." Without missing a beat, Trump stepped back and said something no one expected. "Come with me to the stage. I think the country needs to hear this." Gasps rippled through the crowd as the president turned and led Jace toward the platform. Every camera lens locked onto them, the world watching in real time. Jace looked stunned but followed his commander-in-chief. His boots hit the platform with hollow thuds, his breath quickening as he stood before thousands. President Trump stepped up to the microphone first. "Today," he said, "was intended to honor our fallen heroes. But sometimes, the most powerful stories are the ones we don't plan to share." He turned to Jace's son. "If you're comfortable, the mic is yours." Jace looked out at the silent crowd. He held the microphone with both hands, as if grounding himself in the moment. "My name is Lance Corporal Jace Turner," he began slowly, voice shaking, "and I wasn't supposed to be here today. At least, not alone." A hush blanketed the audience. Even the wind seemed to pause. "I lost my best friend in Afghanistan," Jace continued, "Private First Class Owen Grant. We trained together, we shipped out together, and before we deployed, we made a promise to each other. No matter what, we'd come home together." Jace stopped, taking a moment to compose himself. "But Owen kept that promise in a way I never imagined." He took a deep breath and closed his eyes, the memory returning in full force. "We were on a supply mission. Routine. Easy. That's what they told us. But nothing about that day was routine. We are ambushed, gunfire, explosions, chaos, everywhere. We took cover behind a crumbling wall, pinned down with no way out." His hands trembled now as he spoke. "That's when Owen saw it. A grenade had landed right between us. I froze, but he didn't. Without thinking, without hesitation, he threw himself on it." The crowd collectively exhaled, shocked and awed. He looked at misso.com, so sure, and said, "You're going home. Tell them I kept my promise." Jace choked on the words, barely able to continue. "He was more than my best friend. He was my brother. We were supposed to open a garage together. When we got back, he was engaged. He was just a month away from leave." President Trump stood beside him, his head lowered in silent respect. "And since that day," Jace whispered, "I've carried the guilt of surviving when he didn't." Trump reached out, placing a hand on Jace's shoulder. "That guilt means you loved him like family," he said gently. "But son, you didn't break the promise. He fulfilled it." Jace looked up at the president, his eyes full of gratitude and pain. Trump turned back to the microphone. "Let me make something clear to everyone watching. The sacrifice of one brave Marine saved another. That is the very definition of loyalty, courage, and love." Applause rose, not thunderous, but solemn, heartfelt. "And this story," the president continued, "isn't just about loss. It's about what we choose to do with the life we're given, thanks to the sacrifices of others." Trump then asked, "Did Owen leave anything behind? A letter? A note?" Jace nodded, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small worn envelope. its edges frayed, its contents clearly cherished. He wrote this the night before our final mission, Jace said, voice low. I haven't read it to anyone before. He opened the letter with shaking hands and began to read. He told me not to open it unless something happened, Jace said softly, holding the worn envelope in trembling hands. President Trump looked at him with quiet gravity. Would you be willing to share it with us? Jace hesitated for a moment, then gave a slight nod. With careful fingers, he opened the envelope. The paper inside, aged increased by time and grief. The silence around him was complete as he unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the familiar words he had read so many times before, but this time he would share them out loud. His voice, though low, was steady. Jace, if you're reading this, then I didn't make it. Don't blame yourself. I know you'll try, but please don't. Just know this. You were worth saving. You always were. You've got the kind of heart that changes people. So don't spend your life trying to repay me. Just live fully, both of us. Tell my mom I went down proud. And tell Claire I loved her till the very last second. Keep the promise, Jace. Be the man we dreamed of becoming. Owen. A silence fell across the crowd, thick and unmoving. Even the birds seemed to still mid-flight. Jace swallowed hard, his voice cracking with emotion. I've read that letter 100 times, he said, but today, it's like, I finally heard it. President Trump nodded, visibly moved. America just did too. Just then, a voice rang out from the crowd raw, trembling, filled with tears. I'm Claire, I'm Owen's fiancée. Everyone turned. A young woman stepped forward, no older than her hands shook. Tears streamed down her face. She clutched something tightly to her chest, a framed photo of Owen in uniform. Security began to step in, but Trump gestured for them to stand down. Jace stared at her. Stunned, she slowly made her way to the stage, and as she climbed the steps, Jace rushed forward to help her. Their eyes met, no words were necessary. Claire fell into his arms. I've been looking for you, she whispered. I never got the chance to thank you. Jace shook his head gently. You don't need to thank me. Claire held up the photo. He saved you because he knew you'd carry his legacy. Now, it's time you live it. President Trump stepped forward, clearly touched. The two of you represent something this country rarely gets to see: grief and grit, love and loss, legacy and loyalty. The moment was unscripted, unplanned, and unforgettable. Trump turned back to the microphone, his voice steady with emotion. This young Marine and this brave young woman just reminded us what this nation is built on: sacrifice, loyalty, and honor. And I believe stories like theirs deserve to be heard. The crowd erupted into a standing ovation. Veterans stood at attention, saluting. Mothers wept. Flags waved like they were part of the heartbeat of the land. Jace turned to Claire and whispered, I didn't expect today to become this. I was just trying to say goodbye. She gave him a soft smile. Maybe this isn't about saying goodbye. Maybe it's about starting again. Trump leaned back into the microphone. Jace, Claire, will you both accompany me to Owen's grave today? Let's honor him properly. They both nodded, tears welling in their eyes at the gesture. As they walked through the sacred grounds of Arlington National Cemetery, the silence was reverent. They headed toward Section 60, where many of America's most recent fallen heroes lay. Reporters and camera crews followed at a respectful distance, careful not to disturb the quiet reverence that surrounded them. When they reached Owen's headstone, Claire knelt beside it, her eyes fixed on the name carved into the marble. Jace stood silently beside her, offering a slow, respectful salute. President Trump removed his hat, eyes steady on the marker. Claire placed the framed photo on the ground and whispered, I brought you home. Jace stepped forward. Owen, I kept the promise. I'm still here. I'll live for both of us. Trump knelt down beside them, placing a presidential challenge coin gently at the base of the stone. Rest easy, Marine, he said quietly. Today, we don't just honor Owen Grant. We remember every unsung hero whose name we don't always speak, but whose sacrifice has shaped this nation. There were no speeches, no cameras zoomed in. No one interrupted the moment. The country simply watched and listened. After the ceremony, Trump surprised both Jace and Claire by handing Jace a sealed envelope. From one man who knows the weight of duty to another, he said. Later, in private, Jace opened it. Inside was a handwritten note in President Trump's unmistakable script. Jace, you carry more than your own life now. You carry a legacy. Don't let it crush you. Let it lift you. I see greatness in you, not just because you wear the uniform, but because you never stopped caring. That's rare. That's power. Donald J. Trump, also included in the envelope, was a full scholarship offer for any field of study. Jace chose and a letter of personal endorsement for a national leadership training program. Claire, too, received a grant funding to complete her education and to build a support network for military fiancés and widows. And so, the young Marine, who had once stood quietly in a crowd, hiding behind the weight of a single tear, became the reason an entire nation stood tall. Inside the envelope was more than a letter, it was a future. Along with President Trump's handwritten note of encouragement was a full scholarship offer for any degree. Jace wanted to pursue in a letter of endorsement for advanced leadership training. It was an opportunity few ever received, especially for someone who had once stood quietly in the shadows of a crowd, burdened by grief. Claire, too, received something remarkable, a foundation grant that would allow her to complete her education and establish a support network for military fiancés and widows. Two people brought together by tragedy were now being empowered to create something lasting and meaningful. The Marine who had once wept alone was now the reason an entire nation stood taller. Just a week later, the story had spread across the country. News outlets ran features on the emotional ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery. One headline read simply, "The Tear That Moved a Nation." The impact of that single moment, Jace's honesty, Claire's strength, and Trump's gesture ignited a ripple effect. In response to their story, President Trump established the Owen Grant Legacy Fund, a national initiative created to support the families of fallen service members. Jace and Claire were named as the fund's first official ambassadors. At their first public event together, Jace stood at the podium, this time with confidence, not guilt. His voice was strong and clear. "This fund isn't just for Owen. It's for every soldier who gave up their tomorrow so we could have our today. We owe them more than medals, we owe them meaning." The speech was powerful and deeply moving. It went viral. Donations poured in from all 50 states. Military families wrote letters, sharing their own stories of love, loss, and the struggle to find peace. Claire also addressed the audience, her words resonating deeply. Grief doesn't have to be the end. Sometimes it's the beginning of something even stronger. Behind the public spotlight, healing continued in private. One quiet evening, Jace heard an unexpected knock at his door. When he opened it, he found a gentle-eyed older woman standing there. It was Mrs. Marlene Grantone's mother. He stood, frozen. "Ma'am," he said, his voice cracking. She smiled kindly. "I had to meet the man my son gave his life for. He's..." Welcomed her in. Visibly nervous, Claire sat nearby, offering quiet support. Marlene reached out and held Jace's hand. "Owen wrote to me often," she said. "He talked about you all the time. Said you had a heart big enough for two." Jace's eyes filled with tears. "I'm just trying to live in a way that would make him proud," he whispered. "I know you are," she said. She placed Owen's old dog tags in his hand and closed his fingers around them. "Then keep trying to take a piece of him with you." It was a moment of deep grace, one that stitched together the torn fabric of grief and gave it strength. As Jace dove deeper into his work with veterans through the Legacy Fund, Claire launched her own initiative, Letters from the Home. It became a national community writing project where the families of service members could write letters, share stories, and begin to heal through words. At one local event, Claire read a letter from a mother whose son had survived, thanks to another Marine's sacrifice. "To the Marine who saved my son, you may never know us, but because of you, we still get to hear our boys' laughter every day. You gave us more time. We can never repay that." Claire paused, her voice thick with emotion. "Sometimes, we focus so much on who we lost, that we forget who we saved." The crowd stood, applauding her with reverence and respect. Thousands of miles away, President Trump watched the live stream from his office. He turned to an aide and said, "That young woman is going to change this country." Despite the public recognition and national admiration, Jace still battled his inner demons, the ghosts of war, the weight of survival, the memory of that moment when he lived, and Owen didn't. One night, unable to sleep, he walked alone to Section 60 of Arlington, back to Owen's grave. The stars were out, the world quiet. He knelt in front of the headstone and whispered, "I'm doing everything I can, but it still hurts." He clenched the dog tags in his fist and bowed his head, overcome. A soft voice broke the silence behind him. It was Claire. "You don't have to carry this alone," she said gently. He looked up, ashamed. "I don't want you to see me like this." Claire knelt beside him, her presence calm and unwavering. "You're not weak, Jace, you're human." She reached out and held his hand. "Let the pain walk beside you, but don't let it lead." That night, for the first time in a long time, Jace didn't cry alone. Months later, Jace and Claire were invited to the White House for a private meeting with President Trump. As they sat in the Oval Office, Trump looked Jace in the eyes and said, "You remind me of a young soldier I once met in New York. He had that same fire. You've got it too." Jace replied humbly, "I'm just trying to make Owen proud." Trump nodded and slid a folder across the desk and offered to serve as National Veterans Youth Advisor, helping shape future veteran support programs. "You don't have to say yes today," Trump said. "Just think about the lives you can still save." That evening, Jace and Claire sat on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. As city lights shimmered, Jace admitted, "I'm scared. What if I mess it up?" Claire leaned on his shoulder. "You were enough the day Owen saw something worth saving." That quiet moment brought clarity. The next morning, Jace called the White House. "I'm ready, sir. Let's make it happen." At his first event in a rural Ohio high school, Jace spoke to teens, many from military families. He shared his story, Owen's sacrifice, and what it means to carry a legacy. Courage doesn't always wear a uniform. He said, "Sometimes it's just showing up even when it hurts." Afterward, a young boy told him, "My brother didn't come back either, but you made me feel like he didn't die for nothing." Jace knelt beside him and said, "He didn't, and neither will you." Later, Jace received a handwritten letter from President Trump. "Leadership isn't about perfection, it's about presence. You've stood tall, in ways most never do. You didn't just live through pain, you gave it meaning." Enclosed was a photo of that moment in Arlington, the tear, the handshake, the crowd rising behind them. On the back, Trump had written, "This moment didn't make you. You made this moment." As months passed, Jace and Claire's love only deepened. One day, at the Arlington hillside where everything began, Jace knelt again, not in grief, but in hope. "Will you marry me?" Claire said yes through tears. At their wedding, President Trump made a surprise appearance, lifting a glass to their resilience. That night, dancing under fireworks, Jace whispered, "We kept the promise." Owen. Years later, a statue stood in Arlington of a young Marine with a folded letter and a tear on his cheek. The plaque read, "Dedicated to those whose courage begins with grief," and to one Marine whose tear reminded a nation to stand together. When asked what changed his life most, Jace said, "A president asked me why I was crying, and gave me the chance to turn that tear into purpose."